Hi and welcome to the third exam question walkthrough for AQA GCSE history, and this section is on the conflict and tension section, the Cold War between 1945 and 1972. So the first question you will get on the Cold War section is a 4-mark "this source shows". So you will get given a source and you will be given a statement by the examiner, something like source A is critical of or is supportive of, in this case, critical of the USSR. How do you know? And you've got to refer to the source and your contextual knowledge in order to be able to answer that question. So this question will require 5 minutes in the exam. The structure is 1 paragraph. And you will need some of your own knowledge to explain how you know the source is critical. In this case, the example source is a cartoon by Leslie Illingworth from the Daily Mail on the 6th of March 1946. And hopefully you will have spotted that this cartoon relates to the Iron Curtain speech made by Churchill in March 1946. So there are 2 parts to this answer. What you need to do first is start by labelling the source, and then have a look carefully at the provenance. So you need to look carefully at the content of the source. So what can you see in the source itself that is critical of the USSR? So for example, in this one, we can see people running away in the background. And then the provenance of the source, the where, when, who, what, and why of the background of the source. So the fact that this is made from by somebody who was British during the period of the Cold War, how does that then affect whether it's critical or not of the USSR? So in order to answer this question, you need to write just 1 paragraph, but you do need to comment on 2 different things. So source A is critical of the USSR as it shows, and that's where you talk about the content of the source. And source A is also critical of the USSR as the provenance shows, and that's where you refer to the background of the source. So here's a model answer. Source A is critical of the USSR as it shows Churchill peeping below a curtain put up by order of Joe to keep the West down. What I do then is then refer to the own knowledge. So this is referring to the Iron Curtain that was called by Churchill in his speech in March 1946, when he said that Joe, in this source, Joseph Stalin, had divided the continent in half and forced communism on many Eastern European nations. And this is consolidated by the fact that you can see people running away in the background of the cartoon. Source A is also critical of the USSR as the provenance is from a British cartoonist, it's published in a British newspaper, and we know at this point at the beginning of the Cold War that Britain were anti-communist, and therefore it's no surprise that they are critical of the USSR. Question 2 on the conflict and tension section is a 12-mark usefulness question. Now, as this question is worth 12 marks, you would spend about 15 minutes on this question. You need to write 3 paragraphs, and you do need to use your own knowledge. So the example question is, study sources A and B. How useful are these to a historian studying the Marshall Plan? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your contextual knowledge. And here we have 2 sources. The first is a cartoon and the second is part of an interview with a Soviet diplomat. Now, what you need to remember when you're answering this question is that all sources are useful. So the question isn't really asking you how useful are these sources. It's asking you, why are these sources useful? So for example, this cartoon, why is this source useful to a historian studying the Marshall Plan? What does the source itself tell us, so the content? And then what does the provenance tell us? The fact that this was made by an American artist in 1947, the fact that he has sat down and created that piece of artwork, what does that tell us that people were thinking about, talking about, that they wanted people to believe at that time? So for this question, you need to use 2 sources. So those will be the makeup of your main first 2 paragraphs. Your third paragraph, your conclusion, will talk about using the sources together. From those sources together, what could a historian find out? Do they show alternative views of the same event? Do they show different views of the same person in history? How do they differ? Both of those sources taken together, what do they tell the historian? So in terms of model answer, here's the model answer for source A. The source is useful because it shows a historian studying the Marshall Plan that Europe, as you can see represented by the man in the painting, is climbing a cliff using the rope of the Marshall Plan. He's climbing away from communism, represented by the Russian-style buildings at the bottom of the cliff. And this suggests that the Marshall Plan helped Europe escape, and without it, it would have fallen under communist influence. Then you need to apply your own knowledge. So in 1947, this Marshall Plan, or European Recovery Programme as it was also known, put billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe. $13.5 billion was divided amongst the 13 countries who were willing to accept aid in the form of money or resources. It allowed the broken economies of Europe to recover, and therefore communism became less popular. And then the source is also useful to a historian as the provenance is a form of American propaganda during the Cold War, because it shows how the Americans were rescuing Europe from the evils of communism. And this source, therefore, reflects the American view of the purpose of the Marshall Plan. And then the next part of the model answer shows you how you would structure your conclusion. So once you've done the same thing for source B, in this case, I've put here both sources are useful to a historian studying the Marshall Plan as they give different perspectives on that plan. So the cartoon, the source in source A tells you an American view. The extract from the interview in source B gives you a Soviet view. So whereas source A tells a historian the American view of the plan's intention, source B shows how the plan was received in the Soviet Union. So although they both talk about the Marshall Plan, they both give different angles of that plan, and that's the kind of conclusion the examiner wants you to come to. The third question in walkthroughs for conflict and tension is the 8-mark write an account question, where you have to give a narrative account. So you would be given 10 to 12 minutes in the exam to complete this question. You'd be required to answer in 2 paragraphs, and you will need to use your own knowledge. Now, this question is really tempting to just write down everything you know about the topic. So, for example, write an account of how the Korean War became an international crisis. Really, really tempting to just think, oh, I know all about the Korean War, and just kind of go into a bit of verbal diarrhea where you write down everything you know about Korea. And really what this question is asking you is how that war became a crisis. So it is an explain question. So the question usually involves telling the key moments of an event. You will need to describe, explain, and analyse how one event led to another. So how did the outbreak of the war become an international crisis? And the examiner really wants you to think about initially, so short term, and then long term. Do not just retell the story of the event. So in terms of structure, paragraph 1 might be the Korean War became an international crisis firstly because, and then the second way the Korean War became an international crisis is because. And I've included here some language that you might want to think about using as part of your answer. So for example, this led to, therefore, this caused, consequently, it became an international crisis because, the crisis escalated and got worse because, tensions increased because. So all the time you're thinking about the consequences of that war and how it became an international crisis. So in terms of model answer, the Korean War became an international crisis firstly because in March 1949, Kim Il-sung, the communist leader of North Korea, asked Stalin directly to support an invasion of non-communist South Korea. Although Stalin didn't directly intervene, he did support with weapons and equipment and encouraged the Chinese to support the North. Although he was making his position clear that the Soviets would not fight directly against the Americans, he was clearly encouraging the communists to aggressively claim more land with help from other communist nations. And therefore it became an international crisis because of Stalin's intervention in encouraging North Korea. Secondly, this war became an international crisis because America was willing to go to war in order to contain communism and keep it from spreading further to South Korea. So when the communist North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, invaded the South in June 1950, America immediately asked the United Nations for a ceasefire and realized that the repercussions, if the South was to become communist, would be huge for America. The North was supported with weapons and equipment from Stalin, and therefore America wanted to ensure that they were containing communism and preventing its spread. And with United Nations backing, therefore, the United Nations sent troops to support Rhee in the South, showing they were prepared to risk American lives in order to ensure this containment. And therefore, it blew up into an international crisis. So the important thing with this question is not just retell the story, to make sure you have distinct paragraphs with two different reasons about how the war became a crisis. The final question on the walkthroughs for conflict and tension is a 16-mark question: how far do you agree? And this question will require you to use at least 20 minutes of your time to write 4 paragraphs, and you will need to use a considerable amount of your own knowledge. So here is an example question. The shooting down of the spy plane, the U-2 spy plane, was the main reason for an increase in tension between East and West between 1960 and 1962. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. So there are 2 things that you need to make sure that you highlight and draw your attention to once you open the paper and look at this question. The first thing is that whatever the examiner has highlighted as the first factor, you must write about that. Your first paragraph must talk about that particular incident. Secondly, what are the dates and topic that your focus of your answer must be on? In this case, it's tension between 1960 and 1962. So I cannot write, for example, about the crisis over Berlin in 1948. I wouldn't get any marks for that. So the question is worth 16 marks, but you also have 4 marks for SPAG. So I've just put some hints down at the bottom here about things that you might want to check with your SPAG. So not just spelling and punctuation, but have you used a range of historical terms? Have you used good grammar and not written as you speak? Now, when you open the paper and you look at the question, the first thing that you need to do once you've highlighted what you're going to be writing about is a plan for your answer. So in this case, our named factor we must write about in our first paragraph is the shooting down of the U-2 plane in 1960. We must then think of 2 other incidents between 1960 and 1962 that could be our other reasons for an increase in tension between that period. And then our conclusion, we will decide whether it really was the U-2 spy plane or whether another event was more important. And when you think about that, really the question is asking you about relative importance of these different factors. And therefore at the bottom is some language that you might want to think about using. So you might talk about an event being a catalyst for something else. You might say that an event was crucial, or that it was negligible, that it was insignificant, or that it was fundamental, it was essential. Now, as with the same essay question, virtually the same on the health topic, there are 2 ways that you can go about answering this question. So when you've thought about what you're going to be writing about and you started to look at your plan, you should make a decision whether you think it was the shooting down of the U-2 plane that was most important or not. If you think it was the shooting down of the U-2 spy plane, then your answer will start something like, the shooting down of the U-2 spy plane was absolutely crucial to the increase in tension between East and West between 1960 and 62. And you will then give a variety of supporting evidence as to why that is the case. So why did it lead to increasing tensions? Your second paragraph will then start, admittedly, and you will choose a second event that was also a contributing factor. And then your third paragraph will be your third event that was also a contributing factor. If you think a different factor other than the shooting down of the U-2 plane was most important, then your essay will start, admittedly, the shooting down of the plane was an important factor. And you will still give some reasons why that did contribute to an increase in tensions. But your second paragraph will start, however, X factor was more important, and then you'll explain why. Once you've done that, you will then need to come to your conclusion, and it's really important that you haven't changed your mind by the time of the conclusion. Don't flip-flop about and change your mind. Whatever you've put in your first paragraph must be what you replicate in your conclusion. Try and think about all of the factors that you've written about representing a pillar holding up a building. So if the shooting down of the U-2 plane is one pillar and you have two other pillars, why is it that the shooting down of the U-2 plane is the most crucial one? Why, when you take away those other two events, will the pillar still hold the building up? Why is it so crucial? Could it be the case that without this event, you wouldn't have had that event? Or this event led to that event? For example, if you think the shooting down of the U-2 spy plane was crucial, would that have had any impact without the Paris Peace Conference straight afterwards? How do they relate? And then when it comes down to your conclusion, then you structure it by actually answering the question, it was the main reason for tensions and here's why, or it wasn't, here's the more important factor. So in this model answer, I've talked about what I would put in my first paragraph. So the shooting down of the U-2 spy plane was the most important reason. It was crucial for several reasons. The shooting down and subsequent trial of Gary Powers came at a time when relationships were improving between the two sides. President Eisenhower hoped to end his presidency by beginning a new age of cooperation. However, the existence of the spy plane showed that far from trusting the USSR and cooperating, America was still in fact spying on its rival. The wreckage and Gary Powers himself were shown on Soviet television, and there was no doubt that what he'd been doing in Soviet airspace. The existence of the plane then led to increased mistrust and therefore tension. In addition, Eisenhower's failure to admit straight away that it was a spy plane and to try and cover it up played into Khrushchev's desire to show that he was a strong leader who would stand up to America. And therefore, the shooting down of the plane led to significantly more mistrust and tensions at a time when relationships had been getting slightly better. Therefore, my second paragraph would then start admittedly. So I've chosen the building of the Berlin Wall might be another factor that I write about. My third paragraph might highlight the tension in Cuba and the missile crisis of 1962. And here's my conclusion. In conclusion, the shooting down of the U-2 spy plane was the most significant reason for the increase in tension because it was the catalyst for a period of increasing tensions after a period of more cooperation. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin Wall were both events which escalated tensions, so I'm not denying that those events did increase tensions, but if it wasn't for the U-2 spy crisis, tensions would not already have been at a height. It was clear after this that improving relations or thaw was over, and America after that tension began to feel they were losing the Cold War. So the new President Kennedy was expecting to inherit an improving relationship with the USSR when he took office at the end of 1961, but instead tensions were very high once again. And that concludes the exam walkthroughs for the conflict and tension topic.